Parents who got reported to CPS for speaking their native language at home? What happened? The CPS investigator was already inside my house when I got home from work, sitting at my kitchen table with my 7-year-old daughter, while my wife stood in the corner with her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own pieces together. The investigator had a manila folder open in front of her and was asking Hannah questions in that artificially gentle voice adults use when they're trying to get children to reveal secrets. I dropped my briefcase on the floor, and the sound made everyone turn to look at me. The investigator stood up and introduced herself as Linda Kowalski, 15 years with Child Protective Services, and said we needed to talk about some serious concerns that had been reported about our family. My daughter's face was streaked with tears, and my wife's eyes were red and swollen. I asked what was happening, and Linda said someone had filed a report claiming our children were being isolated, prevented from speaking English, and potentially experiencing educational neglect due to language barriers we were deliberately maintaining. I'd been living in this neighborhood for 8 months when the trouble started, though I didn't recognize it as trouble at first. My wife Minji and I had moved to suburban Ohio from Seattle after I got transferred for my job in pharmaceutical research. We'd bought a house in a quiet development with good schools and families who seemed friendly enough at the homeowners association meetings. We had 2 kids, Hannah, who was 7, and Ethan, who was 5, both born in the United States and completely bilingual in English and Korean. At home, we spoke primarily Korean because that's what felt natural, and because we wanted our children to maintain connection to their heritage and be able to communicate with their grandparents who lived in Seoul. In public, at school, with friends, the kids spoke perfect English without any accent or difficulty. They were both excellent students, Hannah reading above grade level, and Ethan already doing basic math that impressed his kindergarten teacher. We were normal parents living a normal life, raising our kids to be bilingual and bicultural in a country that supposedly valued diversity. The neighborhood seemed fine initially. People waved when we drove past, smiled at the kids playing in the yard, made small talk about weather and lawn care when we ran into each other at the mailbox. Our next-door neighbor was a woman named Deborah Winters, mid-50s with blonde hair she kept in a severe bob and a tendency to watch the street from her front window like she was monitoring for violations. She'd introduced herself the day we moved in, bringing over cookies and asking pointed questions about where we were from, how long we'd been in America, whether we spoke English at home. I'd answered politely, explaining we were from Seattle originally, that I'd been born in America and Minji had immigrated as a teenager, that our kids were native English speakers who also spoke Korean. Deborah had smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said that was interesting, that she hoped we'd teach our children to appreciate American values and the importance of English as the primary language. Minji had gripped my hand hard after Deborah left, saying something felt wrong about that conversation, but I'd told her she was reading too much into it. People were curious about newcomers. It was normal. The first real incident happened 3 months after we moved in, on a Saturday morning in May when the kids were playing in our backyard. I was inside making lunch and could hear them through the open kitchen window, laughing and chattering to each other in Korean while they played on the swing set. They were making up some elaborate game involving princesses and dragons, switching between Korean and English the way bilingual kids do, using whichever language had the right word for what they wanted to express. I heard Deborah's voice from her yard asking the kids what language they were speaking. Hannah explained they were speaking Korean because that's what they spoke with their parents sometimes. Deborah's voice went sharp and cold, telling them this was America and they needed to speak English. Hannah, confused, said they did speak English. They spoke it at school and with friends, and they were bilingual. Deborah said speaking foreign languages at home would confuse them and make them bad at English, that their parents were doing them a disservice by not making them speak English all the time. I came outside immediately and found Deborah leaning over our fence, literally looming over my children, telling them they needed to practice English more. I asked Deborah politely but firmly to not comment on our parenting choices or our language use at home. She straightened up and said she was just trying to help, that she'd seen families like ours struggle because the children couldn't properly assimilate. I told her our children were perfectly assimilated, perfectly bilingual, and perfectly fine. She said she'd worked as a teacher's aide for 30 years and knew what she was talking about, that children who spoke foreign languages at home always had problems in school eventually. I pointed out that both our kids were doing exceptionally well academically. Deborah's face went tight and she said we'd see, that these things caught up eventually, that she was just trying to look out for the children's best interests. She went inside her house, and I thought that was the end of it. Minji said we should document what happened, write down the date and what Deborah had said, just in case. I told her she was being paranoid. Deborah was just an old busybody who didn't understand bilingualism. It would blow over. Looking back, I should have listened to my wife's instincts. She'd grown up experiencing the kind of casual racism that I, as someone who'd always lived in diverse urban areas, had mostly avoided. She recognized the danger signs that I was too naive to see. The school call started 2 weeks later. Hannah's teacher, Mrs. Kimberly Stevens, called asking to schedule a meeting to discuss Hannah's language development concerns. I was confused because Hannah's last report card had been all excellent marks, glowing comments about her reading ability and verbal skills. Mrs. Stevens said she'd received information suggesting Hannah might be struggling with English comprehension due to primary use of another language at home. I asked where she'd gotten that information because it was completely false. There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Stevens said a concerned community member had reached out with observations about our family's language patterns. I felt my stomach drop. I asked if this concerned community member was named Deborah Winters. Another pause. Then Mrs. Stevens said she couldn't disclose who had made the report, but that the school was obligated to follow up on any concerns about student welfare. I told her to give Hannah any English assessment she wanted, that my daughter would pass with flying colors because she was a native English speaker who happened to also speak Korean. The assessment happened 3 days later. Hannah came home confused and upset, saying a lady had pulled her out of class to ask her lots of questions and make her read things and explain pictures. Minji held her while she cried, asking why the teacher thought she was bad at English. We explained that some people didn't understand that speaking 2 languages was a good thing, not a bad thing, and that the test would prove she was doing great. The results came back a week later, showing Hannah was reading at a 4th grade level in 2nd grade, had perfect English comprehension, and showed no signs of any language-based learning difficulties. Mrs. Stevens called to apologize for the disruption and said the concern had been unfounded. I asked if she would be telling Deborah Winters that her report was baseless and potentially harmful. Mrs. Stevens said she couldn't discuss the source of the report, but that the matter was closed from the school's perspective. I said I'd appreciate her documenting that our family had been falsely accused of educational neglect. She said she'd make a note in Hannah's file, and we ended the call. Deborah escalated after that. She started watching our house more overtly, standing in her yard whenever the kids played outside, taking photos with her phone when we spoke Korean to each other in our own driveway. Minji noticed it first and started feeling anxious about letting the kids play outside. She said Deborah was documenting us, building some kind of case, and we needed to be careful. I thought she was overreacting, but I also started noticing Deborah's constant surveillance. The woman was retired and apparently had nothing better to do than monitor our family's every movement. I caught her filming us through our kitchen window one evening while we were having dinner and speaking Korean. I went outside and confronted her, asking what she thought she was doing. Deborah said she was documenting concerning behavior for the authorities, that someone needed to protect those children from being isolated by their own parents. I told her to stay away from our property and our family. She smiled and said she was within her rights to record what was visible from public areas, and that if we weren't doing anything wrong, we shouldn't worry about being observed. I called a lawyer the next day. Robert Sullivan had been practicing family law in Ohio for 18 years and came recommended by a colleague at work. I explained the situation, and Robert listened carefully, taking notes. He said that, unfortunately, unless Deborah was directly harassing us or trespassing, recording us from her own property wasn't illegal. He said the bigger concern was her pattern of making false reports to institutions, which could potentially constitute harassment. He recommended documenting everything, every interaction, every time we caught her filming, every call from the school or any other authority. He said if this escalated to anything more serious, we'd want a clear timeline showing malicious intent. He also said something that made my blood run cold. He said that in cases like this, sometimes people made reports to Child Protective Services, and while those reports were almost always unfounded when it came to bilingual families, the investigation process itself could be traumatic. I asked what we should do to protect ourselves. Robert said to keep living our lives normally, document everything, and call him immediately if CPS showed up. He said Ohio law was clear that speaking a language other than English at home was not neglect or abuse, but that didn't always stop people from making accusations. The CPS report came 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in August, when Minji was home alone with the kids. She called me at work, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. She said a CPS investigator had shown up at the door with a report that needed to be investigated immediately. The investigator, Linda Kowalski, had explained that someone had filed a detailed complaint alleging that our children were being isolated through forced use of a foreign language, that they were struggling in school due to limited English exposure, and that we were potentially preventing them from integrating into American society. Linda had asked to speak to the children separately from Minji. My wife had said she wanted to call our lawyer first, and Linda had explained that refusing to cooperate with an investigation could be noted in the report and could potentially escalate the situation. Minji, terrified and not knowing what else to do, had allowed Linda to question Hannah while she stood in the kitchen trying not to cry. I told her I was leaving work immediately and to not answer any more questions until I got home and we could call Robert. I made it home in 20 minutes, breaking several traffic laws in the process. Linda was still at our kitchen table, now talking to Ethan, asking him about what language Mommy and Daddy spoke at home, whether he understood everything his teachers said at school, whether he had friends who spoke English. Ethan, 5 years old and confused about why a stranger was asking him these questions, kept looking at Minji for reassurance. I interrupted and introduced myself, probably more forcefully than I should have. Linda stood and shook my hand with professional calm, saying she was following up on a report of potential educational neglect and language-based isolation. I asked to see the report. Linda said the reporter's identity was confidential, but she could share the general allegations. She pulled out a printed document and read from it. The report claimed our children were forced to speak only Korean at home, that they were punished for speaking English, that they were falling behind in school because of limited English proficiency, that we were deliberately preventing them from participating in American cultural activities, and that neighbors had observed the children appearing confused and distressed when spoken to in English by other adults. Every single allegation was a lie. I felt rage building in my chest, but forced myself to stay calm. I told Linda that our children were completely bilingual, that they spoke English perfectly and spoke Korean as a heritage language, that both kids were excelling in school, and that I could provide documentation proving everything in that report was false. Linda said she'd need to verify that through her own investigation. She asked if she could look around the house. I asked if we were required to let her. Linda said technically no, but cooperation would help resolve this faster, and refusing could be interpreted as having something to hide. I called Robert right there, put him on speaker, and asked what we should do. Robert asked Linda to identify herself and her credentials, which she did. Then he asked what specific allegations of abuse or neglect were being investigated. Linda read the list again. Robert said none of those allegations constituted abuse or neglect under Ohio law, that speaking a language other than English at home was protected under the First Amendment, and that he was advising his clients to cooperate with a brief walkthrough, but to decline any further questioning without legal representation present. Linda did a quick walk through our house, opening closets and checking the kids' bedrooms. Everything was clean, organized, age-appropriate. The kids had toys, books in both English and Korean, art supplies, everything normal children have. Linda took photos of the bookshelves, which I later learned was because the reporter had claimed we only had Korean language materials in the home. Our shelves were about 60% English books and 40% Korean books, a normal ratio for a bilingual household. Linda asked the kids a few more questions with Robert listening on speakerphone. She asked Hannah what her favorite book was. Hannah said it was a series called The Magic Tree House, and started explaining the plot of the last one she'd read, in perfect English with advanced vocabulary. Linda asked Ethan what he liked to do at school. Ethan said he liked reading time and playing with his best friend Lucas, and he wanted to be a firefighter when he grew up. Both kids were articulate, happy, healthy, and clearly fluent in English. Linda made notes and said she'd need to follow up with the school and review the children's academic records. I said fine, they'd find that both kids were advanced students. Linda said she'd be in touch within a week with next steps. After Linda left, Minji collapsed onto the couch and started crying in a way I'd never seen before. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She said she'd never been so scared in her life, that she'd thought they were going to take our children. I held her and promised that wouldn't happen, that we'd done nothing wrong and the investigation would prove it. But I was scared too. I'd read stories about CPS removing children from homes based on misunderstandings or false reports, about how hard it was to get kids back once the system had them. I called Robert back and asked what we should do to protect ourselves. He said to gather documentation immediately. School records, report cards, teacher evaluations, medical records, anything showing the kids were healthy and thriving. He said to write down everything we remembered from Linda's visit, word for word if possible. He said to prepare for this to get worse before it got better, that even when accusations were obviously false, the investigation process had to run its course. He said he'd request copies of all documentation from CPS and would start building a defense file. I asked what it would cost. Robert said his retainer was $5,000, and this could easily run to $15,000 or more if it went to court. I had that in savings, barely, but it meant emptying our emergency fund. I told him to start the work. The next day, I filed a police report about Deborah's harassment. Officer Jennifer Chang, 12 years with the local police department, took my statement at the station. I explained the months of surveillance, the false report to the school, the recording of our family, and now the CPS report that appeared to contain information only someone watching our house constantly would know. I showed her photos I'd taken of Deborah filming us, timestamps showing the pattern. Officer Chang said that unfortunately, most of what I was describing didn't meet the legal threshold for criminal harassment in Ohio. She said, unless Deborah was threatening us, trespassing, or interfering with our daily lives in a way that caused substantial emotional distress we could prove, it was considered a neighbor dispute. I asked about the false CPS report. Officer Chang said making a false report to CPS could be a crime, but I'd have to prove the report was knowingly false and made with malicious intent. She said the best thing I could do was document everything and consider getting a civil restraining order if the behavior continued. She made a report for the record and gave me a case number, saying it would at least create a paper trail if things escalated further. Linda Kowalski showed up at Hannah's school the next week and pulled her out of class for another interview. The school called me afterward to let me know, which they were required to do. Hannah came home that day and asked me why the CPS lady kept asking if we hurt her, or locked her in her room, or didn't give her food. I felt sick. I asked what she'd told Linda. Hannah said she'd told the truth, that we never hurt her, that she had her own room with all her toys, that we ate dinner together every night and she got to help cook sometimes. She said Linda had asked if we punished her for speaking English and she'd said no, that we spoke both languages at home and it was normal. I hugged her and told her she'd done great, that she'd told the truth, and that was all she needed to do. But I was furious that my 7-year-old was being repeatedly interrogated by an investigator looking for abuse that didn't exist. I called Robert and demanded to know if this was legal. He said yes. Unfortunately, CPS had broad authority to investigate, and that included interviewing children without parental consent. He said the good news was that Hannah's consistent statements about being well cared for would be documented. The bad news was the investigation was going to continue until Linda either found something or conclusively determined there was nothing to find. Linda came back to our house the following Monday with a supervisor, a man named Gregory Foster, who'd been with CPS for 23 years and managed the investigations unit. They wanted to do a more thorough home inspection and interview both kids again. Robert came to the house for this visit. He sat in on every interview, took his own notes, and objected when Linda's questions became leading or inappropriate. Gregory mostly observed, but I could see him taking in the house, the kids' interaction with us, the bookshelves, the family photos on the walls showing our extended family in Korea, and our kids at various American activities like baseball and swimming lessons. At one point, Gregory asked me directly why we chose to speak Korean at home. I explained that Minji's parents didn't speak English fluently, and we wanted our children to be able to communicate with their grandparents. I explained that bilingualism was an asset, not a deficit, that research showed bilingual children often had cognitive advantages. I explained that our kids' English was perfect, and their Korean was fluent, and we were proud of raising them to be bicultural. Gregory nodded and made notes. He asked if we'd ever prevented the kids from speaking English or punished them for it. I said absolutely not. That would be insane and counterproductive. The school records came back showing both kids were excelling academically. Hannah was in the gifted program. Ethan had been recommended for advanced reading. Their teachers provided written statements saying both children were articulate, social, well-adjusted, and showed no signs of language difficulties or educational neglect. Mrs. Stevens, Hannah's teacher, wrote a particularly strong statement saying she'd assessed Hannah personally after a previous unfounded concern and found her to be one of the highest performing students in the grade. The pediatrician we'd been taking the kids to since we moved to Ohio provided medical records showing both children were healthy, up to date on vaccinations, and had no signs of physical abuse or neglect. Dr. Patricia Morrison, 15 years in pediatric practice, wrote a letter stating that in her professional opinion, our children were thriving and showed every indication of being well cared for. I sent all of this to Robert, who compiled it into a defense file that was now over 100 pages long. He said it should be enough to close the investigation, but that CPS would likely drag it out another few weeks just to be thorough. During this time, our lives became unbearable. Every time the kids played outside, I wondered if Deborah was watching and building more false accusations. Every time my phone rang, I worried it was Linda calling with new concerns. Minji developed an anxiety disorder and started having panic attacks whenever someone knocked on the door. She stopped speaking Korean to the kids in public, terrified that someone would overhear and report us again. I watched my confident, vibrant wife become fearful and withdrawn, constantly looking over her shoulder. The kids started asking why we didn't speak Korean as much anymore, and we didn't know how to explain that we were being punished for our heritage. Hannah told me one day that a boy at school had said her family was weird for speaking a foreign language, and she'd felt ashamed. I was furious that my daughter was learning to be ashamed of her culture because a racist neighbor had weaponized the child protective system against us. Robert requested a formal review of the case at 6 weeks. He submitted our entire defense file and demanded that CPS either file charges or close the investigation. Linda responded with a letter saying the investigation was ongoing and they had concerns about the children's cultural isolation. Robert fired back with a letter citing First Amendment protections, federal case law on language rights, and Ohio's own policies on cultural sensitivity and child welfare. He pointed out that cultural isolation would mean preventing children from participating in their heritage culture, not maintaining it. He included documentation of our kids' involvement in both American activities like soccer and Korean cultural activities like language school on Saturdays. He threatened to file a civil rights lawsuit if CPS didn't close the investigation within 2 weeks. Gregory Foster called him the next day to schedule a final review meeting. They wanted to interview the children one more time with a child psychologist present to assess their emotional well-being. Robert said fine, but he was bringing his own expert to observe. The final interview happened in mid-September at the CPS office. Linda, Gregory, and a child psychologist named Dr. Ann Montgomery were on one side of the table. Robert, Minji, and I were on the other, with Robert's expert, Dr. James Kim, a child development specialist with 20 years of experience in multicultural families. Hannah and Ethan were interviewed separately in a playroom with one-way glass so we could observe. Dr. Montgomery asked them about their family life, their feelings about their parents, whether they felt safe at home. Both kids gave clear, consistent answers. They loved their parents. They felt safe. They were happy. They liked speaking Korean and English. They liked their school and their friends. They wanted to visit their grandparents in Korea next summer. Dr. Montgomery did some developmental assessments and found both children were advanced for their age in language, cognitive skills, and emotional regulation. At the end, she said she saw no indication of abuse, neglect, or emotional distress. Dr. Kim concurred, adding that the children showed every sign of being secure, well-adjusted, and benefiting from their bilingual, bicultural upbringing. Gregory Foster closed the investigation that day. He said the allegations had been thoroughly investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. There was no evidence of abuse, neglect, or harm to the children. The case was closed and would be marked as unfounded in their records. I asked what would happen to whoever made the false report. Gregory said that information was confidential, but that if they determined a report was made in bad faith, they could refer it to law enforcement for criminal charges. I said I wanted them to pursue charges. Gregory said he'd review the case file and make that determination. Linda, who'd spent 6 weeks investigating us, said nothing. She looked uncomfortable, which I took as a small victory. Robert asked for written documentation of the case closure and confirmation that this would not remain on any permanent record accessible to future employers or background checks. Gregory said he'd have that sent over within 3 days. We left the CPS office and I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. But the relief was mixed with rage at what we'd been put through. I filed for a civil restraining order against Deborah Winters the next day. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Robert sent her a letter informing her that she was not to contact our family, record our family, or make any further reports about our family to any authorities. The letter outlined our intent to pursue harassment charges and a civil lawsuit for emotional distress. Deborah responded through her own lawyer, a man named Paul McCarthy, who specialized in defending people from frivolous lawsuits. Paul's letter said his client had been exercising her civic duty to report concerns about child welfare and was protected by law from retaliation for making good faith reports. Robert wrote back with a detailed timeline of Deborah's harassment, the false allegations she'd made to the school and CPS, and the documented evidence that every report had been unsubstantiated. He included a copy of the police report Officer Chang had filed. He said if Deborah wanted to claim good faith, she'd need to explain why she'd continued making reports after the first one was proven false, and why her reports contained information that could only have been obtained through unlawful surveillance of our private property. The restraining order hearing happened in early October. Judge Margaret Foster, 32 years on the bench, heard both sides. Deborah's lawyer argued that his client had reasonable concerns about children she observed struggling to communicate in English with neighbors. Robert presented our timeline of harassment, the recordings Deborah had made of our family, the false reports to multiple institutions, and the affidavits from Hannah's teacher and our pediatrician stating the children were thriving. He played a recording I'd made of Deborah telling my kids they needed to speak English and stop speaking their foreign language. Judge Foster's expression grew colder as the hearing progressed. She asked Deborah directly if she'd made the reports to CPS. Deborah said yes, she'd been concerned about the children. Judge Foster asked if she was aware the investigation had been closed as unfounded. Deborah said she still had concerns. Judge Foster asked what qualifications Deborah had to assess child welfare or language development. Deborah said she'd worked with children and knew when something was wrong. Judge Foster granted the restraining order and added that if Deborah made any further reports to authorities about our family, she could be held in contempt of court. She also referred the case to the prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges for filing a false report. The prosecutor declined to file criminal charges 2 weeks later, saying it was too difficult to prove malicious intent. I was furious, but Robert said it was expected, that the bar for criminal charges was very high. He recommended we move forward with the civil lawsuit for harassment and emotional distress. I asked how much that would cost. Robert said it would likely cost us another $15,000 in legal fees, but if we won, we could potentially recover damages and attorney fees from Deborah. I talked to Minji about whether to pursue it. She said she wanted Deborah to face consequences, that what happened to us could happen to other families, and Deborah needed to be stopped. I agreed. We filed the lawsuit in November, seeking damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and a court order preventing Deborah from ever making false reports about our family again. Deborah's insurance company got involved and tried to settle immediately. They offered us $25,000 to drop the suit. Robert advised taking it, saying a trial would be expensive and unpredictable. I said no. I wanted this to go to court. I wanted Deborah's actions exposed publicly. I wanted other families to know they could fight back. The trial was set for February, 4 months after the restraining order hearing. In the meantime, our story started spreading through the Korean-American community in Ohio. Other families reached out saying they'd experienced similar harassment for speaking Korean at home, for sending their kids to Korean language school, for maintaining cultural traditions. One family said they'd stopped speaking Korean entirely after a teacher told them it was confusing their son, even though he was bilingual. Another family said they'd been reported to CPS for the food they packed in their kids' lunches, with someone claiming the smell of kimchi was evidence of forcing children to eat inappropriate food. I was horrified by how common this was. Robert suggested we contact a civil rights organization that specialized in language discrimination. He put me in touch with an attorney named Lisa Park, who worked for a nonprofit that defended linguistic minorities. Lisa said our case was a textbook example of how child protective services could be weaponized against immigrant and minority families, and that she'd love to represent us pro bono alongside Robert. I accepted immediately. Lisa filed an amended complaint adding civil rights violations under federal law, arguing that the CPS investigation had violated our First Amendment rights and constituted discrimination based on national origin. She also filed a separate complaint against the county CPS agency for failing to properly screen the initial report and for pursuing an investigation that had no legitimate basis. This escalated the case significantly. The county sent their own attorneys to defend against the allegations. CPS maintained they'd followed proper procedure and that the investigation had been warranted based on the information in the report. Lisa subpoenaed all of Deborah's communications, including her Facebook messages and emails, looking for evidence of bias. What she found was damning. Deborah had been part of an online group called Protecting American Children that shared conspiracy theories about immigrant families and encouraged members to report suspicious behavior to authorities. She'd posted about our family specifically, calling us those Koreans next door who refused to assimilate and asking for advice on how to get CPS to remove our children. She'd coordinated her reports to the school and CPS with other members of the group, using language they'd suggested to make the allegations sound more serious. The trial started on February 15th and lasted 3 days. The courtroom was packed with members of the Korean American community, other families who'd experienced similar harassment, and local media who'd picked up the story. Deborah's attorney tried to portray her as a concerned citizen who'd acted in good faith. Lisa systematically destroyed that narrative. She presented the Facebook messages showing premeditation and bias. She brought in expert witnesses on bilingualism who testified that our children's language environment was not only normal, but beneficial. She had our pediatrician testify about the children's excellent health and development. She had both kids' teachers testify about their academic performance. She presented the entire CPS investigation file, showing that every allegation had been investigated and proven false. She showed the recordings of Deborah harassing our children about their language. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. They found in our favor on all counts, awarding us $115,000 in damages and attorney fees. They also issued a permanent injunction preventing Deborah from making any future reports about our family without documented evidence of actual abuse or neglect. The verdict made regional news. The local newspaper ran a story titled, "Family Wins Lawsuit After False CPS Report Over Language Use at Home." The article detailed the case and included statements from civil rights advocates about the growing problem of child welfare systems being weaponized against immigrant families. Lisa gave interviews explaining how speaking a heritage language at home was protected by the First Amendment and was not evidence of neglect or abuse. She called for CPS agencies to implement better screening procedures to prevent false reports based on cultural bias. The county CPS agency announced they were implementing new training on cultural sensitivity and would be reviewing their report screening procedures. Linda Kowalski, the investigator who'd spent weeks trying to build a case against us, was reassigned to administrative duties. Gregory Foster sent a formal apology letter acknowledging that our investigation should have been closed much sooner once the initial allegations were proven false. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Deborah never apologized. She moved out of the neighborhood 3 months after the verdict, before we could collect most of the damages the court had awarded. We heard through neighbors that she'd declared bankruptcy, and the judgment would likely never be fully paid. I didn't care about the money anymore. What mattered was that we'd won. We'd fought back against someone who'd tried to destroy our family out of racism and xenophobia, and we'd proven that families like ours had rights that couldn't be violated just because we spoke a different language. Minji started speaking Korean to the kids in public again, louder than before, almost defiant. Hana joined a Korean cultural performance group and performed traditional dances at community events. Ethan started attending Korean language school with enthusiasm, proud of being bilingual instead of ashamed. We took the kids to Seoul that summer to visit their grandparents, and watching them communicate fluently with their family in Korean made everything we'd fought for feel worth it. A year after the trial, I was contacted by a state legislator who wanted to introduce a bill protecting families from discrimination based on language use in child welfare investigations. He asked if I'd testify at a hearing about our experience. I agreed and spent an afternoon at the state capitol telling our story to a committee of lawmakers. Several other families testified too, sharing their own experiences of being reported to CPS for speaking Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin, and other languages at home. The bill passed unanimously and became law 6 months later. It required CPS agencies to receive cultural competency training, mandated that reports based solely on language use be screened out as inappropriate, and created a process for families to file complaints about discriminatory investigations. The law was named the Family Language Protection Act, and while it came too late to help us, I hoped it would protect other families from what we'd endured. Lisa Park called to congratulate me when the governor signed it, saying our case had been the catalyst that made lawmakers pay attention to an issue they'd previously ignored. Our family healed slowly from the trauma of those months. Minji's anxiety improved with therapy, though she still sometimes gets nervous when there's an unexpected knock at the door. Hana, now 9, talks about wanting to be a lawyer when she grows up so she can help families like ours. Ethan, 7, switches between Korean and English without thinking about it, the way bilingual kids should. We're still in the same house, in the same neighborhood, but it feels different now. Other Korean families have moved in, and there's a sense of community we didn't have before. We speak Korean loudly in our yard, in the grocery store, at the park. We refuse to hide who we are or apologize for our heritage. Deborah Winters tried to make us ashamed of our language and our culture. Instead, she made us fighters. She made us advocates. She made us stronger than we were before. And while I wouldn't wish what we went through on anyone, I'm proud of how we fought back and won. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.